I'm very pleased to have today with us Rahul Ranjan, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Oslo Metropolitan University for the Riverine Rights project, funded by the Research Council of Norway. Currently, he is speaking from Dehradun in Uttarakhand in India, where he's pursuing his research further, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But what really got us talking, Rahul and I, was his work on Riverine Rights, which is, a very important topic about judicial rights and judicial frameworks. And it speaks directly to the issues of multi-species worlds we are trying to address. So Rahul, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ravi.
So Rahul, we'll just start with asking you about a bit about your interest in the idea of rights of nature, and in this case, riverine rights. What draws you to that space?
Right, it's interesting. So one of the ways in which I've come to rights to nature is through my PhD. During my PhD, I worked on Adivasi land rights and struggles in Jharkhand. And towards the tail end of my PhD, while I was doing my fieldwork based in Khuti, as with many anthropologists, I happened to have a great encounter with a group of people who were Adivasi activists and were very fiercely engaged in protection of land rights, but also educated me into extending the lens of understanding land rights into environment in general. So I sort of moved away from, or extended my work from looking at land and its consequences on memory of Adivasis in India into what would it mean to speak of environment in general in the emergent crisis of climate change. So this project, which is based in Oslo, I'm a postdoc to this, and it allows me to extend my own research that is interested in investigating how people and their life world are constructed around environment, and B, to investigate ways in which law can be used as a tool to grant certain imagination to people that extend beyond humans, and in that way I think I came to realize, and it's been a fantastic learning curve as a postdoc as I go on to do research here.
Right. So it opens up so many lines of interesting conversations for this project. One is directly to your idea of law and the extending it to a non-anthropos world, but also what you first said about the Adivasi land rights and the meaning of land and rights in that other knowledge system, other ways of thinking, other ways of being, even possibly. Mm-hmm. So, and third is your work on pain, memory, and loss. So if we could talk, we'll unravel all these three, because I think these are all very critical points of entry. But we could start with something you've written about recently about law and rights and nature's rights, where you've examined 3 case studies of Colombia, New Zealand, and India, where rights of rivers, and in Colombia it's more extended, I think, have been granted and then kind of granted, but not really granted, because in India the Supreme Court also stalled that or shut it down in a sense. So firstly, if you could tell us a bit about the Indian case study, what it means and doesn't, the challenges it has, and then we'll talk about the legal sort of framework challenges.
Thanks. Great question. So, I mean, the idea of rights to nature it's not a new idea as such. So, in 1972, Stone he wrote an article, "Should Trees Have Standing?" that had inaugurated this sort of discovery of law into non-human. But subsequently, the article was followed up by courts in the US and then later on in other parts of the world. I'm just setting a context to the discussion.
Yeah.
And in 2009, you have Ecuador, sort of building up this new constitution and providing space for granting rights to nature. and you see a trajectory from there onwards into making of this non-human perspective into the legal imaginary across the world. So it went on. In 2010, Bolivia passed a law of rights to nature, and eventually in 2017, which is sort of a landmark year because you had New Zealand, which is passed the Act Deava Act, which is about the Wanganui River, granted a legal personhood, becoming a legal entity. And it was followed up by what had happened in India into 2017 itself in March on 20th, when this Uttarakhand High Court, based in Nainital, had passed an order saying, judgment saying, granting rights to both Ganga and Yamuna, giving them a status of living entity. But there are technical and interesting differences in each one of this. So since I'm a part of a project that looks at 3 case studies of New Zealand, Colombia, and India, I think it's useful to bear in mind that that the legal imagination or granting of legal personhood in the case of New Zealand stemmed from a very sustained body of movement that sort of went on for over 100 years in New Zealand. So that's one solid formation that led up to a moment of legal discovery, right? And other was that the law was passed in the parliament, unlike India where it was a court order. And in that process, what had happened in at least New Zealand was that a lot of law was written into through the knowledge that was produced by indigenous people. So if you read just the bare law of the bare act of New Zealand, you will discover how much of what they call as rights to nature or rights to river is contingent on the knowledge of the indigenous community. So it sort of foregrounds that the law had to extend its own limit in order to address pre-existing formations of rights that was there within the community and Maori in this case, in indigenous community in New Zealand. Whereas in India, it's interesting, Ravi, because India, unlike New Zealand, has had no movement as such. And it's disputable in a way that you can say the language of rights to river have always existed in India, which I also agree. So Nadi Ka Adhikar, and there's several small, big initiatives around India, but they've never been a movement called rights to nature, and especially rights to river. And that sort of makes India's case both interesting and also pose a sort of limitation in the way it pans out. So in 2017, on 20th March, Rajiv Sharma, Honorable Judge Rajiv Sharma, he passed a judgment granting legal rights to both Ganga and Yamuna and all its tributary. But it was also more, so this court judgment had come in response to a petition that was filed by Muhammad Salim in 2004 against the sand mining, right? So it does not emerge from a dialogue that was well sustained for a couple of years through a movement, engaged participation, community ownership, etc., had not taken place. It had come directly from a court by a judge who decided to use this incredible idea and grant legal personhood to these 2 really different rivers very far away from Wanganui. But the judgment has a lot of excerpts quoted from that New Zealand. So in one sense, New Zealand sort of stand out for any case study to be used as a model for legal citations.
The New Zealand case study is based on tribal law in a sense, or tribal interaction or knowledge, whatever is the correct word. Does it kind of become like a customary law kind of thing which has been practiced for a long time and gets read into another framework of of law, which also happens in other practices in India.
Hmm.
But in India, it's really about coming from the outside, but read, I think it's also read in a religious context, the Indian law or Indian order. So they're very different roots of both of them. And does it also mean that, and it's a question to you, I don't know, because of New Zealand's long history of the treaty between the indigenous people and the settlers, and India having no such kind of, our customary laws are read in particular religious practices, etc. The histories of both nation states are very different. And is part the reason why these rights are looked at differently? These orders were different. Part of that historical differences as well.
Yeah. I mean, New Zealand case is quite interesting in a way that it stretches the boundaries of law into accommodating some of the existing indigenous cosmological belief system, but also epistemic order, because there existed a clear difference between what Maori would consider or perceive of the larger environment, and what the law had to do in addressing this is similar sort of sites that were identified during the making of the act. But yeah, I mean, in India, it's not the case. I mean, in one sense, when you read the text, the judgment by Rajiv Sharma, you do get a sense of quite religiously heavy text. In a way, it's laid out. And it's interesting because both New Zealand and India has common law. And one of the ways in which common law as part of Commonwealth function is using precedent as a way to justify legal orders. And in both cases, they've used different legal precedent to justify it. And interestingly, in New Zealand, you see a lot of precedent or discussion or reference to precedent are very different from what you see in India. In India, at least in the judgment by Rajiv Sharma, it's very Hindu-heavy text. So there are several references that are made quite rightfully at several instances without much dispute, but it also suggests a certain way in which Judge Sharma is trying to lay out what it means to be granting rights to river. And I think in order to communicate that language much better, he takes up the precedent that a Hindu-heavy text, right? So he uses a lot of legal precedents that are based on Hindu idols, which makes the case very interesting. But I must point out that there is a major difference between New Zealand and India in a way that Indian court, at least in my reading of the judgment, he does not, Judge Sharma does not refer to a lot of, because India has a very thick tradition of environmental jurisprudence, right? And you have extensive number of petitions going into court against violation of rights of, if not rights, at least of rivers in general. So it's interesting how he does not use that wealth of resource to justify claims, and instead goes on to use, land dispute, idle, cases of idle in order to justify, and it makes it less communicable in some sense, because then you don't really know where he's getting at.
So he's also sort of shifting the boundaries, because it's not, as you said, referring to traditional environmental impact assessment or limits to nature destruction or ecosystem services kind of things, where this kind of looking at limits to what you can do to nature without having detrimental effects. And this is a sort of a different kind of normative standards could be used for that, and are also present in some cases. How much sand, it becomes a question of science. How much sand can you take out? How much impact is that? How do you measure impact? And he moves away from that to a completely different ontology almost of an idea of worship and of reverence and of goddess and motherhood, or whatever the ways reverse. So it's a complete shift. And it's a big leap for a legal system which is based on a modern constitution to do that, in a sense. And so you also write in your paper very extensively on the difference between constitutional and environmental law, and how constitutional law becomes the aspirational go-to when environmental law, which is very detailed in the way I'm saying it, it goes to principles. For example, constitutional law has been evoked by the Indian Supreme Court on things like precautionary principle or polluter pays principle. So they're all read into constitutional Article 21 of Article 14 or whatever that is, and read as part of that kind of rights, in a sense. So would you like to reflect on that, how that plays out here in other places, and has environmental law, to your view, limited itself to very technical law, and then hence the need to take recourse to constitutional law all the time in Indian courts, for example, and always happen at the Supreme Court level, because the Supreme Court is the one which is looking at the big picture of what this means. So that's where these big judgments have flowed out over the years in India.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Very interesting. I'm not a lawyer. I'm trained
I know, but you have worked in it, so.
Yeah, I'm trained as a political anthropologist, and one of the things we do
it is even more interesting for me to hear your perspective.
Thank you so much. And I think one way to approach as a political anthropologist is to take law to people, and to understand ways in which they make sense of it. But while writing this article, it was an interesting effort, because it consisted a team of 4 people, of which 2 were lawyers, and Elizabeth Macpherson, she's written this magisterial book on rights to river, and she's a lawyer, and she's been doing all of that for many years. And then you have Catalina, who's based in Colombia. So even as a writing process, just sort of drawing on my own experiences of doing an academic work together from different disciplines was quite a cursory to understand how different field also have its own ways of approaching to the problem. While I was reading Indian litigation and cases around it, and I think I began and I relied heavily on, Mehta's 3 different cases that came on. MC Mehta's case that started as Ganga 1, 2, 3, etc. And I thought the environmental law that, or at least the movement towards recognizing environment within law, at least in the early period of 80s and 90s, were driven more in terms of protection, like safeguarding right against some form of violation, right? And you have different kind of legal measures in place against these forms of violation, and it's very directed and political in nature, because what MC Mehta was trying to do was extremely important. You have these leather tanneries discharging effluences into the river and effectively choking it down to death, even for biotics. So in that sense, you see a lot of work within environmental law done in order to ensure non-violation. But I think this judgment was very interesting because it moves away from that. And we're trying to argue in our article, saying that these kind of all these 3 judgments that's come in different countries sort of suggest a move towards environmental constitutionalism. So now environmental constitutionalism, in our understanding, is that when courts begin to concede to the fact that there is an emergent crisis, which is the climate change, which is going to have not just residual but very prominent impact on environment in general, but rivers in particular, because you have massive glacial discharge, abrupt rainfall, etc. So we try to show how, especially in India, courts are effectively now using Article 21, as you said, because environment on it, and then that's also my belief, that environment on its own does not have as such a place in Indian legal imagination. It has place, rivers have place, and I'm very, as I go learning about it, I think rivers have place insofar it has a meaning in relation to humans, right? So even while we're saying that the law sort of moved the lens from anthropocentric to non-human, I think the modes of listening, registering voices of non-human, is also mediated by human forces, and which is not bad in a way, because it's constitutional laws, and laws in general on environment have its own sort of time
Yeah.
in which they evolve. So I thought that the judgment on Ganga and Yamuna, and it was followed up by another judgment in the case of Lalit Miglani versus State of Uttarakhand, which is well within the 20 days of time, which granted rights to river, rivulets, forest, animals,
Yeah.
and it has its own problem. But I'm just saying that this force of force of energy towards conceding to the fact that there is a crisis
Yeah.
is quite exemplary in case of
And
what happened. Yeah.
what do you think about this idea of personhood and granting, what you might call um, a certain representative personhood? That means, I think in the New Zealand case, the representative personhood, if I might be allowed to use those terms, was the community there. And in this case was a bureaucrat who was also part of other river development bureaucracies. And so there was a kind of conflict of how do you do both things. And so this becomes a critical thing of how do you then represent the personhood or the right you've granted in a system which needs that voice and standing up for that right and defending that right, somebody to speak for the river. So yeah, before I have a follow-up on that, but if you want to comment on that, please do.
No, I mean, you're spot on. I mean, with your analysis, I mean, this is one of the biggest sort of legal loophole there is in this act, in this judgment, not in the act in New Zealand, but in judgment in India, that you have three luminaries appointed as the guardian, and there is, I must have forgotten, but there's a major difference between New Zealand and India in terms of how river is identified. So in case of India, the river is identified as a minor. So therefore, the custodianship of the river has to be a human who would mediate rights and obligation, right? So in case of India, the court, Sharma appointed three luminaries, including Chief Secretary of the State, as the guardian of the river, which makes it very tricky and also limited in a way that it does not allow riverine communities that are most impacted by both law and climate change at the same time.
Yeah, and now moving on to what is the core of your research, and your interest is this as a political anthropologist. So I want to sort of broadly propose and ask, if when you're looking at indigenous communities and indigenous knowledge systems and relationships, both epistemological and ontological relationships, can I say that the idea of rights only starts to appear when there is that breakdown in that relationship? If there's no breakdown, the idea of rights is sort of inbuilt into that relationship. You don't have to externally impose it. So it's like this entangled rights which become entangled and need to be disentangled because you've already created that break, the nature-culture divide, if I broadly want to say. If that is true, if that kind of thinking is true, then the break has been pretty much precedes the idea of rights. It's been historically, there's another place where the breaks are happening. And when we think of multi-species world, we're trying to heal those breaks through getting these legal frameworks from a different system onto another way of thinking about rivers. But there's also a break with thinking about where these exist, where these continuities exist, where the relationship with rivers are more everyday and reciprocal. And if so, what do you see? How would you react to something like that? Because you not only are investigating current communities, but you're also investigating other systems.
Right. If I've understood you clearly, I mean, there is one, I mean, problem that I think exists on the conceptual level, right? So one is that what is a river,
Yeah.
right? And more research that goes into making of my own project, less clarity I have about the question, which means I'm learning, because this constant production of challenge to what you think of a river. And I think that's something the law and lawyer and the judge should have thought through more clearly when
I'd like
passing
to
a
reflect
judgment.
a bit more on this really interesting question, what is a river? I think it's a very core question.
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying this at different places. It's the same thing, but I think in my mind, rivers are but narratives, right? They take different forms, shape, an idea, depending on where they are, and then is surrounded by, and it's always in relation to something, right? So river on its own is not is not evident. It's evident when it's in relation to, let's say,
Right.
soil, in relation to riverine community. But river is also very complex in terms of how we define any ideas. So for instance, my recent study in Jamoli incident, which had happened last year, I was trying to understand what it means to be um, looking at a river that floods, right? And different responses from different people who were impacted by the incident tells me that there is no one meaning of river. So a lot of people consume river as merely material object that draws out certain benefits for them, right? And therefore it becomes a mutual relationship. Whereas other looks at it through cosmological worldview, in which river occupies a place of heritage in constellation of their past memories. Similarly, as river becomes extremely quantifiable when it comes downstream and is dammed, and it becomes a vehicle for electricity production, and in the minds of people who are qualified as technically, um, you know, who sort of speak from a place of power. In their mind, river is very clearly a material that needs to be utilized in order to produce. So I do think that rivers are but narratives, and that points us towards an epistemic warfare, as I think there is, between who gets to speak about river and what gets to be defined as a river. So our aquifer, and especially in Himalayas, in Ravi, much more than I do, and I'm still learning. There are more than 1 million aquifers. So are aquifers not rivers? We think of river only through glacial discharge, but that's not true. You have the whole of Himalayan river Ganga and Yamuna is fed by forest.
Yeah.
You have these small little creeks and rivulets flowing into. And when I was in Himachal for another study, and I found out similar. So I mean, it's both beauty that you can't have a fixed definition of the river, but it can become a problem.
Yeah.
Because it takes a form of epistemic warfare where people in places of power of position get to define what they think it is, and therefore can rule out other ways of doing, knowing, and thinking about non-humans, right?
Right. And it's very interesting because what you say about, the different narratives and who gets to speak which narrative, narrative has greater political power. And I'm thinking of also my involvement with environmental standards committees looking at pollution levels and such like to form what they call national standards. And where people like you are never part of those committees. It's people like me who trained as engineers and claim to be environmentalists, become part of those meetings. And they're all mostly people like me, mostly men, who are deciding this. So there is a kind of science narrative which is geared towards what you said. It appears when depends in relationship to what, and in relationship to a kind of use, a kind of control through which the river gets defined for that purpose. So the purposing of rivers already eliminates all the other possible relationships to it. And I think one of the big challenges today, as you said, are aquifers, not rivers, is what we see in the work in the India River Forum is that we are looking at main stems of rivers as rivers, whereas rivers are multiple networks of arteries and, of small and big arteries. So it's literally like a human sort of system of capillaries, and they all add up to this great, mighty central stem, which we then control. So this is I think both, it's a political question as well, because bound with this question is who does it serve best to do this? And because you're an anthropologist, what interests me more is your work with communities, because these are the communities which don't have a voice, because the narratives have no meaning in the narratives of progress and technology and science, and they're not contributing. In fact, they are contesting those. Hence, they are kept out of those voices. So, what do you see when you talk to riverine communities? What do you see, both in terms of the relationship to floods, what we call floods, because the idea of floods itself is in the same framework of those narrowing of narratives into one narrative. That's why you have the floods, because it becomes an event outside that norm, in a sense. So you've done extensive work on this, on looking at what you call memory, loss, and pain. And it'd be really interesting to hear what you see in that and what you hear from there.
Right. Thanks, Ravi. Very, very good question. I think just one, I'm not trying to contest, but just trying to revise something you said. So I don't think people do not have voice. I think voices are structurally decimated, right? Or in other way, which is part of my book that's coming out on Birsa Munda and Adivasi. It's one of the things that I also observed during the PhD process is that it was not the lack of voices, it was the absence of structures of hearing.
Right.
So it was never Adivasi is in the
really well put. I really like that formulation.
Thank you. And it's one of the core argument of my book that it's this assumption that anthropologists in general have that we're going to find out and present a parallel narrative or offer an alternative. There's no alternative. That existed always. It's your finding, you discovering, you educating yourself into it.
Right.
So I mean, in that sense, I think more or less remains same within the water riverine sort of discussion. I think a lot of people who get to say what makes river what it is are already in a place of epistemic hierarchy, right? And their knowledge are constantly validated by use of causal effect, as I call it, knowledge system, right? So constantly validating something in relation to something else, and therefore it is valid. But in Himalayas, I think you were very right when you said, it functions like capillary in like body, and I've been confounded by the amount of aquifer I've seen ever in my life. And I come from a floodplain area of North Bihar, from Darbhanga. And I've had a very different experience of growing up as a child, being hit by flood and having to rescue myself out of the situation. Then from coming up all the way to Himalaya, which is a very different geography. And I think
yourself as you were growing up.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in
Tell us a bit about it. Tell us in a couple of minutes. It's really interesting to know.
Yeah. So I grew up in Darbhanga, which is one of the small towns in Bihar. But as an upper caste, I've always had the privilege of being educated into knowing world and placing myself away from a lot of problems. So my caste privileges have protected me a lot, just to admit that as an academic. But the natural calamities such as flood does not equalize this, but hits everyone differently. So while growing up in 2004, which was one of the biggest flood in my memory, had hit my house, which was built 10 feet over the as in Bihar, at least the part I come from, they call Satasi ka Baad, the
Yeah.
87th flood. My father built this house thinking that we're not going to get hit, and
Like on an embankment or on high ground.
On a higher ground than to the level it was flooded.
And that's also part of the privilege, that you get to build on a higher ground.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, in this case, Ravi, I live next to river. So no matter where my caste order is, one or other day, my house may get dissolved into river, because it's the breaking of what they call duar and char, so formation cutting away and then formation.
Right.
It's frightening. I mean, but yeah, I mean, so and I have just recently written a small fiction piece to process that trauma of having to get the family to the first floor, and you
published that already?
I did, but in a very popular forum. I'll send a copy.
Well, we'd love to have a link on the website for that if you don't.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so I mean, my experiences of flood in Bihar, which is a plain area and flooded by rivers mostly from, and for in this case, Bagmati comes from Kathmandu. It tells you also how it transforms the same landscape. So you have the ghats used as places for riddles and joys and ceremonies. It can also very well turn into sites of mourning and loss, right? Because of the flood that comes. So when I came to work in Himalayas, and I thought that there is one admission that everyone should make, that geographies do play a role in shaping our worldviews, right? So my experiences of flood are very different from, let's say, people who have experienced flood at 6,700 feet up in Joshimath.
Right.
And I think one way to explain this, and I'm writing a longer work on environmental grief within Indian context. This is an incipient idea, but not, but very transformative in some sense. So a lot of indigenous scholars in Canada have written about it, talking about how changing climate are impacting their mental health, but also impacting the ways in which they relate to larger environment that is very well woven within their life worlds, right? And it's something.
Not much written in the Indian context on this.
No, I think, I'm still trying to find out if there is one, and people may have had reflections, but only as footnotes or indexes, but not as a body of content. So I'm trying to do this three different segment work. So one on grief, one on loss, and one on pain, and trying to explain how each one of its work as a structuring affect in people's life. And in Himalayas, I mean, and one way to explain this, why floods are different. So I was speaking to one of the persons in Joshimath, not in Joshimath, in Raini, where the flood hit, and we can come to it later. But this person began to tell me story through specter of fear. So he said when he was working on his, he was grazing his, with his cattle, etc. He was grazing in the land. He said that he heard a big noise of something as if had exploded, and this is the falling of the hanging glacier on Rontigarh,
right?
One of the peaks in Himalayas in Uttarakhand. And the first thing that came to his mind, very interestingly, was, has the China attacked?
Oh,
right. Because this is a frontier state, right? So a lot of structuring of environment is now tied to the idea of securing borders, right? And it left me really puzzled, thinking, why would you think of that? But you do, because you're constantly being witness to
prime fear. That's the first fear in your head.
Yeah, and you're constantly witnessing a flow of, even while I was there, like, you have all weather roads being constructed, and it's something that we can have separate discussion. But I mean, that road infrastructure takes up the metaphor of extending the nation, right? So infrastructure, road is not merely just for conveyance, but it is also an extension of nation's reach to securing border. And then he goes on to explain about how when then the flood came and how he lost his brother. And I mean, in some sense, in these areas, I think people are, most of them who are impacted directly are living with PTSD. There's massive fear among local residents who, and it's, Ravi, it's so it's so strange that you have about 200 and over people being reportedly dead,
Dead, yeah.
and you don't have national coverage for this. You have, national challenge reporting is a highlight of the day. And I'm thinking, what would it take for media to have that, ethical ownership to stories, where and I've spoken to several people now around who've not even known of this.
There's a kind of numbness to tragedy the media has, I think.
Yeah. And also, I think it's, Nainika Mathur, in her book Paper Tiger, she talks about how sort of Chamoli, which was her site in Uttarakhand, sort of, the remoteness of the hill becomes both metaphor and literal.
Yeah.
Literal in the sense that it's far away, and metaphorical that it never reaches the,
Yeah.
the news of the center, whatever that might mean. So it's interesting, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to uncover on that end, especially in relation to multi-species justice. And I think that was pretty evident in the way people explained their relationship to, loss of cattle became like a index in memory, right? Of reminder of pain.
Because of also the special relationship cattle have with the community there.
Yeah, they do.
And also, so it's almost like the loss of family in a sense. But this question of loss, how is it dealt with in indigenous communities, for example? Have you explored that a bit?
Not much, I must say. Because there is, of course, the problem of language, right?
Yeah.
And the community with whom I had tried to speak or trying to learn from them and their experiences spoke in a language that I did not know. So I had a translator at all points who had helped me understand. But it's very complex. I mean, in a way that I had a very clear idea of how grief functions, in lives of people and how it pans out. And I think it's very different in lives of those who are directly impacted, right? So there is a recognition which is very startling. I mean, and also very, sort of a learning curve for me, because I did see across different people that there was an admission to the fact that the nature, whatever that might mean, is changing. And that has direct relationship to the ways in which their lives are organized. So environmental disaster are no more a far distant tragedy unfolding and recuperating.
And
right?
What about a sense of loss which is not based on a disaster or a catastrophe, but an ongoing slow change? How does one think of that? Because that is probably more widespread.
Yeah.
In terms of a loss of something, which is not from one moment to another, but a continuous disappearance. I think I've always been very interested about that. When the absence becomes present, and the loss becomes permanent, and the grief becomes part of your own sort of makeup, in a sense. How does one think of that kind of grief?
Yeah, I mean, in this context, there's a wonderful book by Laura Ogden called Loss and Wonder at the End of the World, I think, if I remember. And she talks about similar things. So, loss is not merely the absence of something.
Yeah.
It is the presence of that absence, right? So it becomes a reminder that you've lost something, and therefore it occupies its own terrestrial life within you. But what you're talking about is, anticipatory grief. You're constantly anticipating in some sort of loss.
Yeah.
Which is a common sense, which is evident. So I'm based in Dehradun, which is a valley and is quite urban and modernizing. But it also has a number of people who are constantly grieving about the fact of change in the landscape, in the way rainfall would happen, in the way land use have shifted. And it's a major problem, the land use in the state of Uttarakhand. But I think it points, what I don't understand is that how have we not been able to transform our anger, loss, and grief into political movement?
Yeah.
What I'm trying to be doing in my writing piece is trying to argue that grief is political. It is no more in the confines of emotional loss. Grief is what it is. It has to become a tool to mobilize. I mean, we talk about non-anthropocentric lens, but I think in India, at least, we fail to humanize the face of climate change, let alone becoming and listening to non-human. I don't understand how and I understand, but I mean, I fail to see how we do not tell stories of loss as more as possible in public spaces as it should be, in order to humanize the cause of
So grief creates agency of sorts.
Yeah, it does, and it's very transformative as a it's not merely a literary, it's not nostalgia.
Yeah, no,
Grief is not nostalgia. It doesn't emerge in lack thereof, right? It
very
emerges
present.
in
It's not
yeah.
not an other thought. It's very much part of your everyday existence. I was thinking that that have the kind of norm in the environmental loss and the environmental idea of change, we are seeing it. We see it. Even climate change, we see the weather changing, and there are those we're seeing the rainfall changing. We kind of know it, even we don't talk about it. So is this like a normalizing of grief? We all we're in a condition of constant normalizing of grief. Is it become a condition of our times in a sense?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm,
yeah, it's a
I'm not
very
extending myself. I'm just sort of it's just it's an extension for an observation or for a reflection. But also, I was interested in that idea of how when you talked of caste and privilege, and whether grief has been differently located in different castes. For example, lower caste, Dalits. Is grief part of the existence of living because you're constantly aware of your own location in the caste system? I mean, in India, if you're low caste, you're constantly one way or other told that you're low caste through
yeah.
exclusions, through violence of both normative and physical violence. How does that, in that sense, you also put an environmental grief on top of that? How does that play out, this interplay of social, political grief and environmental grief, which is now descending more and more?
Yeah, I mean, it only, I mean, caste is an inescapable reality of India. So it only further deepens the problem, right?
Right.
So impact of anything on a scale of whatever that might look like is only going to further entrench the problem for those communities that are historically marginalized, right? Especially, so I'm trying to trace stories of those who've lost life in the dam disaster. So, I mean, officially the notice, I mean, there's no register to sort of prove that whoever have died, and there's no register to show.
Oh, really?
No, I mean, at least in one dam site
Incredible.
in Reni, they don't have. Strangely, while I was, going around in Tapovan, which is where,
Yeah.
people died in the tunnel, so-called run of the river project. There they're trying to build memorial, and as a memory scholar, I mean, I was both fascinated but also deeply struck by a sense of complete alienation. So, Ravi, while I was moving around in the area, uh, um, I heard the Bhojpuri song being played out right above the dam disaster site, and this is 6,700 feet. And it really, and I'm Maithili, my mother tongue is Maithili, but I know Bhojpuri well enough, and so I went up to the overhead of the construction site, and there are these laborers who are trying to do some construction, and I ran into conversation with them, and in that conversation I asked them that I can understand this song and etc., and we broke into a conversation, and it's so painful to realize that a number of people who died, and this has been a point that I've been also trying to argue, that the story of migration is so linear. You always tend to see outflow, you'd never see the inflow, right? So the register of pain loss for those who come to work in these fragile ecologies completely sort of taken off, right? So those who were building memorials were the same people from the same area who must have come to build the dam, who have now died. Right. So in tracing who they are and what they are, most of the people that I spoke to in consent revealing their caste identity were Dalits. Right. So we do know that now very clearly, especially with works coming up with Mukul Sharma and others, that there is a caste ecology in place.
Yeah.
But there's something that also alongside these graded inequality as it is, there's something, some commentary must also be made on the emergent crisis that is climate change. That's going to impact everyone. It may impact everyone differently, but it's going to impact everyone. And so in trying to tell a story of climate change, then what you have to do is to tell stories of entanglement, of how people are no more diffused individuals functioning on their own, but they're also tied to several, you know, and it's interesting because the Uttarakhand elections, I followed it very closely. I mean, they had words like environment, which effectively meant nothing. You know, there was no discussion on climate change. There was no discussion on dams.
Yeah.
And, you know, people like Ravi Chopra, who have produced meticulous work, are now having to resign from high power committee and say that recommendations are not followed. So, I mean, caste is an inescapable reality, and it must be told as a foreground story to explain climate change, migration, inequality, and grief, because it definitely deepens. So one of my respondents who happens to be lower caste and comes from Bihar had informed me the ways in which the loss of his brother basically destroys the whole of the material aspiration of the entire family. Right? These are not land holding upper caste men from Bihar.
Very fragile economies of family units.
Yeah.
One bread earner, maybe, or maximum two or something. So I'll just, because I'm aware of the time, ask you one final question, which, and you can answer it. It's a reflective question. Can we ever think of multi-species justice without looking at social justice alongside? Is it possible? Because if social hierarchies play a key role in the way ecologies are produced or thought of, like Mukul Sharma, as you quoted, said, that the creation of ecology itself is a social hierarchy interaction question, then we are looking at not one nature, but all kinds of natures, you know, all kinds of rivers, who you are. So the idea of environmental justice really an entangled question with social justice as well. It's not a question outside, it's a question within so it's just a thought I have, and I wonder if you have anything to say on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks. It's a great question. I've been thinking far too much about this as well. But I mean, you know, Mabel Denzing, who is an indigenous scholar from Sikkim, she'd written this piece called Living with the Earthquake, where she talks about how indigenous people, lecturers use their indigenous knowledge in order to mitigate or at least cope with the fear of climate change and a changing landscape, and how that sort of but I think why I'm using that article is because it sort of allows me to think about, you know, this Anthropocene, this, you know, this geological epoch in which we are changing the entire sort of, you know, ecology. I think that also, you know, invite us to certain discussion on how the ecology is defined, right? And it's defined by, as you said, marker of social differences and inequality, right? So I don't think you can have a discussion on environmental justice without having discussion on social justice, and therefore any discussion on climate change or environment has to account for, at least begin from, those who are impacted most, and that community is grounded in social reality of a space, right? And in this case, India.
Yeah. Well, you know, this has been a fascinating conversation, and thank you for it. It's, you know, it opens up so many things. It's really exciting to listen to you and to think of what you're researching. So also, I wish you all the best for your research and your upcoming book. And
thank you so much, Ravi.
And for years of new investigations from a young scholar like you, you know, with such a deep political consciousness. So I'm really grateful for your time.
No, equally.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here and speaking with you, Ravi.
Thank you.